Thursday morning, mid-October. The kind of autumn morning where the light comes through the window sideways and everything looks simultaneously more beautiful and more painful than it actually is. I sat in a leather chair across from an estate lawyer named Gerald Freeman. He had kind eyes and the practiced neutrality of a man who had delivered bad news many times and had learned to do it gently, which somehow made everything worse. My brother Daniel sat to my left. He was wearing a suit. He had flown in from Vancouver the night before, gone to the hotel gym at 6 in the morning, and come back pressed and composed. That composure, I would come to understand, was not grief. It was relief. My sister Rachel sat across the table. She had a notepad. I noticed the notepad before I noticed anything else about her. She had brought something to write the numbers down on. I didn't know what numbers she expected. I know now. Gerald opened the folder. My mother's name, Elaine Margaret Harlow. Date of death, September the 3rd. Estate overview. The house at 14 Orchard Lane where I had lived and worked and barely slept for 5 years, an investment portfolio totaling $214,000, a joint savings account, and personal effects. He read the distribution. Daniel, the house. The investment portfolio. Rachel, the savings account. The personal effects. Marcus, $43,000. Access to the storage unit contents. I did not say anything for a very long time. Daniel straightened his jacket. Rachel wrote on her notepad. Gerald Freeman looked at me with his kind eyes and gave me a silence I had not asked for. I drove home to a rented apartment I had moved into 6 months earlier because I had nowhere else to go. I sat down on the kitchen floor and did not move. 4,385 mornings. That's what 5 years of your life comes to when you count the mornings. I know because I counted them that night. Let me tell you how we got here. My mother's name was Elaine. She was 61 years old when she was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. She had been a high school English teacher for 32 years. She read 2 books a week. She made the best roast chicken I have ever eaten in my life, and she never once used a recipe because she said recipes were for people who didn't trust themselves yet. She had a laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants. She sent handwritten letters. She remembered every birthday of every person she had ever known with a specificity that felt like a superpower. She was 61 years old and she was more alive than most people I have ever met, and I want you to hold that specific image of her full and clear and entirely herself before I tell you what came after. There were 3 of us, me, Daniel, and Rachel. Daniel is 6 years older. Rachel is 3. I was the youngest, which in our family meant I was the peacemaker, the one who learned to smooth the edges between Daniel's ambition and Rachel's anxiety and everyone's competing needs. I had learned to manage everyone else's emotions before I fully understood my own. That is a skill that has a cost I am still calculating. When I was 29, I had a career I was building carefully, marketing strategy, consultancy, the kind of work that compounds if you give it time and consistent attention. I had a girlfriend named Lauren 2 years, still genuinely good, still the kind of relationship where you make plans without anxiety. I had an apartment I liked and a set of mornings that were mine. None of this is dramatic, I know. But it was mine, and I need you to understand what mine felt like, what it was worth, before I explain what happened to all of it. My mother called me on a Wednesday in April at 11:14 in the morning. I remember the time because I was in a client meeting and I stepped out immediately because she had never called me during work hours in my adult life. That was the rule. Work was work. She knew that. The fact that she was calling told me everything before she said a word. She said, "Marcus, I think it might be Alzheimer's. Early onset. I need you to come home." I drove 4 hours that afternoon. When I arrived, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table she had sat at every morning of my childhood. She looked completely, entirely like herself. She had made tea. She poured it without spilling a drop. She told me exactly what the neurologist had said with full precision and complete clarity. She said, "I know I look fine right now. I need you to understand that this is what early looks like, and it doesn't stay early." That sentence. It doesn't stay early. She said it quietly with the particular calm of a woman who had already spent several days sitting with information that was going to change everything and had decided that clarity was more useful than collapse. I have thought about that sentence many times since, about what it took to say it like that. I called Daniel that night. He said, "Keep me posted. I'll look into flights." Rachel cried for 12 minutes on the phone and then said she needed to process and would call back in a few days. Daniel did not book flights. Rachel processed for 3 weeks before she called back. I stayed. I slept in my old bedroom and drove my mother to her follow-up appointments, and I started to understand what the coming years were going to look like. I stayed because she was my mother, and because the alternative, leaving when she had just told me it doesn't stay early, was not something I could locate in myself as a real option. In the beginning, there was a version of this I believed I could manage from a distance. I would drive home on weekends. I would organize professional carers during the week. I would maintain the consultancy, the relationship with Lauren, the architecture of my own life while also being available for my mother in the way she needed. I held that version for about 7 months. By month 8, my mother was having night episodes that required a physically present familiar face, not a carer me. There is a specific pattern in certain forms of early onset Alzheimer's where the patient is calm with deeply familiar people and acutely distressed around strangers. My mother was that pattern. She trusted me. Strangers, no matter how qualified, sent her into a state of distress that could take hours to resolve and left her exhausted and frightened in a way that I was unwilling to accept as routine. So I stopped managing from a distance. I stopped pretending I could be in 2 places with the full weight of my attention. I moved back to 14 Orchard Lane. The night I carried my last box in, I sat on the bed in my old room and did a very precise inventory of what I was letting go. Not dramatically, just clearly. The consultancy as it had been. Lauren, possibly. A version of my future I had been building toward. I sat with that list and then I went downstairs and made sure the medication was organized and my mother had eaten dinner and the doors were locked because that was what the next morning looked like and I needed to be ready for it. Lauren held on for 9 more months. She was patient and honest and she told me she loved me and she told me she needed a life she could plan and I told her I understood because I did. She left in November of the first year. She was not wrong to leave. I have never once thought she was wrong to leave. I want to be very clear about that. My largest client let me go in January of the second year. 2 missed deadlines in 3 months was too many at the level we were working at. He was as kind as the situation allowed. Within 6 months, the consultancy had reduced to 1 client, then 0. I was 30 years old. I lived in my childhood bedroom. I was managing medication schedules and medical appointments and laundry and grocery deliveries and the specific emotional labor of being the person who stayed present when someone you love is losing their grip on time. I was doing all of it alone. Every morning, every night. I need you to understand what alone means in this specific context. Not alone temporarily. Not alone until the weekend when someone would come and give me a break. Structurally alone. The kind of alone that doesn't announce itself loudly, it just becomes the texture of every single day until you stop remembering what a day felt like when it wasn't. Daniel was in Vancouver. He described his job in technology sales as demanding, and I believe him because I am trying to be fair in this story even when fairness is difficult. He visited 4 times in 5 years, 4 visits. He always stayed in a hotel because the house was, and I am quoting him directly here, a lot for him to process. He sent money sometimes not consistently, not in any agreed amount, but it happened, and I want to acknowledge it happened, and I want to acknowledge it happened. What Daniel did not do, answer calls after 9 p.m. during crises, respond to messages on the same day when things escalated, alter his schedule when I told him things were critical, come home when I asked him to come home when my mother asked for him by name during her clearer hours, which she did, which I relayed to him, which he acknowledged and then did not act on, come home when I told him, simply and directly, that I was not okay. Rachel lived 40 minutes away. This is the part I find hardest to explain even now. 40 minutes. She visited once a month, sometimes less. When she came, she was genuinely helpful, practically useful, kind, present for those hours. And then she would collect her coat and her bag and drive 40 minutes back to her house and her family and her uninterrupted sleep. I would close the door behind her and feel something I have never found a precise word for. Not anger. Anger would have been cleaner. Something more like the specific grief of watching someone choose not to be present while standing close enough to reach. The grief of proximity without commitment. I have sat with that specific feeling for 5 years and I still don't have a better description for it than that. By year 3, I had rebuilt my entire conception of what a normal day looked like. I woke at 6. My mother woke between 6:30 and 7. Some weeks were good weeks. She was present, funny, able to carry a full conversation, able to reference things from our past with specificity and warmth. Those good weeks were gifts that were simultaneously grieving because I understood their context. Some weeks were hard weeks where the confusion was thick from the moment she opened her eyes and I would talk to her slowly and clearly and then go to the bathroom and run the tap so she couldn't hear anything I didn't want her to hear. I had 2 friends who stayed consistent. They came to the house. They understood that this was the form that friendship had to take right now, and they took that form without making me explain it. Everyone else gradually migrated to a polite distance that functioned as permanent. I don't blame them. What I had to offer socially in those years was limited and required a level of accommodation that most people's lives don't have room for. I understand that. What I didn't understand, or what I couldn't fully feel in real time, was what 5 years of that particular distance was doing to my sense of myself. You lose contact with the version of yourself that existed in the world, the professional version, the social version, the version with plans and a future that felt like it was building towards something. You become, by increments, only the version of yourself that is present in that house, managing that day, getting through until morning. It is not a dramatic loss. It's a slow subtraction. And the specific cruelty of a slow subtraction is that there's no single moment when you can say, that was the day I changed. It's just one morning you look up and the version of yourself you used to know has become very far away. I was 33 years old and I was spending my evenings watching television in the living room while my mother slept in the chair across from me. Some nights that felt like exactly where I was supposed to be. Some nights it felt like something I cannot describe without sounding self-pitying, which I am trying not to be. I am trying to tell you what it was. Not what I think you should feel about it, just what it was. Daniel came home in September of year 3. He stayed 5 days. He brought expensive wine, a good bottle, I will give him that, and he rearranged the kitchen on his second day because he felt things could be more efficiently organized. My mother spent 2 weeks afterward opening the wrong cupboards and being quietly distressed by the unfamiliarity, because spatial memory is one of the first things to destabilize in this disease, and Daniel had disrupted the map she had built for her own home. When I told him this afterward on the phone, he said he hadn't thought about it that way. On day 3 of his visit, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said this, "You need to think about what comes next for you, Marcus. You can't just disappear like this. This isn't sustainable, and honestly, I'm not sure it's the most effective model for mom anyway. Have you looked at residential options? There are very good places." My mother was in the next room. I had been there 3 years. He had been there 72 hours and had rearranged the kitchen. He flew back to Vancouver on a Sunday and did not call for 3 weeks. Rachel's visits had a different texture. Rachel would arrive and cry, not performatively, genuinely, and my mother would comfort her. My deteriorating mother would comfort her daughter who had driven 40 minutes to be there. I watched this happen multiple times. I said nothing each time because my mother was glad Rachel was there. That was real and it mattered, and I was not willing to contaminate it. What I could not say to anyone, what I held by myself, was this: my mother was using her remaining clear hours to comfort the people who were struggling with her illness. I was using mine to manage it. Those are not the same kind of hours, and I spent years watching the distinction be invisible to everyone except me. In year 4, I discovered, not through a dramatic revelation, but through a small slip in a conversation that Daniel and Rachel were having regular calls I was not included in. About the estate, about the house, about what came next logistically. I found out because Rachel referenced a specific decision that had been discussed, and I had no memory of being part of that discussion. I asked her about it directly. She said, "Oh, Daniel just wanted to think through some of the logistics. We didn't want to add to your plate." They didn't want to add to my plate. I was managing medication and medical appointments and night episodes and the physical and emotional weight of 5 years of round-the-clock caregiving. They were protecting me from the stress of being consulted about the estate I was managing. That was the framing. I called Daniel. I asked him directly, "Are you and Rachel having conversations about the estate that I'm not part of?" He said, "We're just making sure things are organized, that you have enough to deal with." I sat with that answer for a long time. I should have pushed harder. I know that now, but I had enough on my plate. And there is a specific kind of exhaustion, the kind that lives in you after years of sustained caregiving, where the energy required to fight one more battle, to push one more conversation, to demand one more thing from people who have consistently not shown up simply isn't available. I let it go. I did not push. That is one of very few decisions in this story that I have complicated feelings about. In March of year 4, my mother had what I can only describe as a perfect day. She was clear from the moment she woke up. She asked for tea and made it herself before I had gotten downstairs. She asked about Lauren. She still remembered Lauren, sometimes still asked, and I would say, "We're not together anymore," and she would nod with the particular expression of someone who understood something I was still processing. That day she said something I want to tell you exactly. She said, "You gave everything for this. Every day I know you gave everything. I need you to know that I know." I said, "I know you know, Mom." She said, "No, I need you to actually hear me say it, not just let it pass. You gave everything, and you are going to be all right. Better than all right. I need you to believe that when I'm not here to say it." I didn't cry while she was in front of me. I went to the garden afterward and sat in the cold March air and cried for about 20 minutes quietly with my back to the house so she couldn't see from the window. Then I came back inside and made lunch and we ate together, and she told me about a student she'd had in 1994 who had written the best essay she'd ever received from a 17-year-old, and I listened to every word. That was the last full, clear conversation we had. She wasn't absent after that. She was still there in the particular things, the way she held her cup, the specific sound of her laugh, the way she tilted her head when she was listening. But the version of her that could sit across from me and look me in the eyes and say, "You gave everything," with full weight and full intent, that version became increasingly rare after March. I held what she said like a kept thing. I still hold it. The last year was the hardest because it was the year I lost her in stages while also knowing the end was approaching, while also managing all the practical and administrative logistics of an ending, while also still being there every morning when she woke and every night when she slept. The specific cruelty of anticipatory grief is that you grieve in advance and then you grieve again when the thing actually happens, and neither instance of grief gives you credit for the other. Full-time care came in during the days of the final 8 months. Her name was Patricia. She was patient and methodical, and my mother came to accept her gradually, not warmly at first, but with the quiet accommodation that characterized my mother's relationship with most things by that final year. Patricia was good to her, I want to say that clearly and without resentment. Daniel came in August. He stayed 2 weeks, the longest visit in 5 years. He sat with my mother every day. I watched him do it and felt something I did not have a clean name for, grateful that he was there, resentful of how late there was, ashamed of the resentment, too tired to work through any of it coherently. I let the feelings exist without resolving them and focused on what needed managing. What I did not know, what I would not discover until October at a table across from Gerald Freeman, was what Daniel had been doing in his private time during those 2 weeks. What appointments had been scheduled, what paperwork had been organized, what my mother, in a period of fluctuating capacity, had been asked to sign. My mother signed a revised will in August, during Daniel's visit. During the final weeks of a disease that specifically and progressively impairs decision-making and the ability to weigh long-term consequences. The legal term for her state during that period is fluctuating testamentary capacity. She had good hours. She had very bad hours. Yet she did not have the sustained, stable, fully informed cognitive function required to make a significant estate revision without independent legal guidance. What she had was her eldest son, who had spent 2 weeks establishing presence after a 4-year pattern of near absence, who had organized an appointment with a solicitor she had never previously worked with, who had been in the room when she signed, and who had brought a witness. The original will, written 3 years earlier, when my mother was legally unambiguous in her capacity, had left the estate equally 3 ways, with a specific written addendum acknowledging that I had assumed primary caregiving responsibility, and that additional consideration was warranted. There was a letter in her own handwriting attached, specific, clear, written in the language of a woman who spent 32 years teaching students to say exactly what they meant. That was superseded. The new will left the house and portfolio to Daniel, the savings to Rachel, and $43,000 to me. I found this out at a table across from Gerald Freeman on a Thursday in October. I want to tell you what it actually feels like to sit across from 2 people who share your blood in a room where your legal standing in your own family story is being read aloud by a man with kind eyes and practice neutrality, and hear numbers that tell you exactly what 5 years of your life was worth in the final accounting. It feels very quiet. That is the most accurate description I have. Not explosive, quiet, like a specific kind of silence that has weight and temperature and a particular quality of light. You understand what you're hearing, you understand it completely, and you sit with it because there is nothing else to do in that room except sit with it. Daniel, when Gerald finished reading, straightened his jacket. He said, and I want you to hear this word for word, Mum's wishes are her wishes. I think we all need to respect what she decided. Mum's wishes. The wishes she formed during a 2-week visit from the son who had organized the appointment and been in the room and brought a witness and whose name appeared as primary beneficiary of those wishes. I looked at Rachel. She looked at the table. She did not look at me once during the reading, not when the numbers were read, not when Daniel spoke, not when I sat there in the particular silence I have just described to you. She looked at her notepad. 3 days after the reading, I called Daniel. I asked him directly, "Did you arrange the new will during your August visit?" There was a pause. Then he said this, "Mom wanted things to be fair. She felt you'd already been compensated through the arrangement 5 years of free accommodation and covered living expenses, Marcus. She wanted the liquid assets distributed to the people who hadn't had that advantage. It was her decision. She was coherent when she signed. Free accommodation, covered living expenses." That is what he had built, a framework in which 5 years of unpaid, round-the-clock caregiving, the loss of a career, a relationship, a social life, a future that had been in construction was reclassified as a benefit I had received. Housing benefit, an expense account. That was the architecture of the argument he had brought to a room with my mother and a solicitor she had never met before. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. The specific nausea of hearing your sacrifice reframed as your advantage. The specific precision of it. He had thought about this. He had found the angle. He had built the language carefully enough to bring it into a solicitor's office and say it with a straight face and have it put in a legal document. That level of deliberate construction is not something you land on accidentally. That is something you prepare. I asked him, Did you tell her what the original will said before she signed the new one? 4 seconds of silence. Then she made her decision, Marcus. I think you need to respect that and move forward. 4 seconds. I have counted them in my head more times than I can tell you. I texted Rachel 3 days after calling Daniel. I said, did you know about the new will before the reading? She waited 16 hours to respond. Daniel mentioned Mom had updated things. I didn't know the specific details. She knew there had been an update. She knew I was the primary caregiver. She had driven 40 minutes to visit once a month for 5 years and watched me carry the full weight of it, and she knew there had been an estate update, and she said nothing. I called her. She answered and immediately started crying, and under any other circumstances, I would have moved toward that would have softened my approach, given her space to process, done the thing I always did. I did not do it this time. I waited until the crying settled, and then I said, did you know I was getting $43,000? She said, I knew it was less than equal. Daniel said you'd been compensated through the living arrangement. I thought maybe he was right. I thought you'd understand. Mom must have had her reasons. You know how much she loved all of us equally. She thought I'd understand. She accepted Daniel's reframe without once coming to ask me, the person who had been there every morning for 5 years, whether the framing was accurate. She made a calculation in private and decided it was not her problem to surface. I said, Rachel, I missed 5 years of my life. My career started from zero. Lauren left. I have been alone in ways I cannot describe to you. And you knew the terms were unequal and you said nothing. She said, I thought you'd understand. I hung up. I haven't spoken to Rachel since. 14 months. That number will be higher by the time you're watching this. 3 weeks after the reading, I received a letter, handwritten, from my Aunt Beverly, my mother's older sister, a woman I had known my entire life, a woman I had loved in the specific, uncomplicated way you love a constant fixture of your childhood. I was not expecting the letter. I was not expecting what it said. Beverly had been present at the August signing. As a witness, Daniel had asked her. She had agreed because my mother asked her to be there and because Daniel had described it to her as a routine update. She had not understood the full contents until the October reading. The letter said this, and I'm going to read you the most important part verbatim. Before she signed, your mother said something to me that I have been carrying since August and I cannot hold it anymore. She said, Bev, I want Marcus to be all right. She said it twice. I should have asked more questions. I should have asked what she meant, what she thought the document said, whether she understood what she was putting her name to. I didn't ask. Thought Daniel had organized it properly. I am so deeply sorry that I didn't ask. My mother said, I want Marcus to be all right twice. Before signing a document that gave me $43,000, I sat with that letter in my hands for a very long time. The specific weight of it, she said it twice. She said it to the only person in that room who might have heard her, who might have stopped and said, wait, do you understand what this says? And that person didn't ask if she trusted Daniel had it organized. She did not ask. I did not respond to Beverly's letter for 3 weeks. When I did, I wrote one sentence. Thank you for telling me. I meant it. I also didn't know what else I could possibly say. The lowest point was not the reading. The reading was a shock, and shocks are survivable because they are specific. You know what hit you. The lowest point was about 6 weeks later, a Tuesday in November. Nothing specific had happened that day. I had applied for a contract and not gotten it. I had made dinner. I had watched television. I was sitting in a rented apartment that still didn't feel like a place I lived, and I was 34 years old, and I had given 5 years in a career and a relationship and a version of my future to something I believed was right. It was the right thing. I would do it again. I have to believe that, and the result of it was a number in a storage unit and a brother I didn't recognize and a sister I couldn't call. I don't want to dramatize a Tuesday in November. I went to bed. I got up on Wednesday. But I want to name the Tuesday because everything that comes after it, the part where things begin to turn, started from that specific evening where I sat on a rented sofa and understood that the people I grew up with had written a different version of me into their story, and I hadn't known I was reading the wrong draft until the final page. That is what the lowest point feels like. Not loud, quiet, specific, and late in the evening. And from that evening, something small but irreversible began. I had been in contact with a solicitor named James Whitfield since October, since the week after the reading. He specialized in contested estates. When I told him the story, he listened without interruption and then said, with the measured directness of a man who had heard many versions of this type of situation, there are several angles worth pursuing. The primary question is testamentary capacity at the point of signing. Secondary is undue influence. I want everything you have documented. What I had documented, as it turned out, was considerable. 47 months of medical records I had personally managed and organized. Documentation of every care decision I had been part of from year one. My own expense records. Beverly's letter, and something I had not yet mentioned to James. Something I had found 3 weeks earlier in a storage unit on a gray November afternoon. I was going through my mother's things in the storage unit, the unit I had been given access to as part of my inheritance, sorting through 32 years of teaching materials and books and the particular accumulation of a life fully lived. I found a phone in a shoebox near the back. An old phone, one she had used for a school digital literacy project in the final years of her teaching career and then migrated to a drawer and then to storage. I charged it. It's still powered on. I opened the voice notes application. She had made 41 recordings between year 2 and year 4 of her illness, during the period when she was still largely clear but had fully understood that clarity was not permanent and had decided to leave something that could not be misrepresented, could not be filtered through someone else's version of events, could not be taken away. She had been recording for herself, for me, for the record. I pressed play on the first one and heard her voice, her actual voice, clear and fully herself, warm and precise and exactly as I remembered her from her best days, and I sat down on the storage unit floor and I did not move for a long time. Because I was overcome, because I needed to be very still in order to hear every word correctly. I am not going to share all 41 recordings with you. That's private in a way that I want to keep private. But I want to tell you what she said and the ones that changed everything. She spoke about each of us, Daniel, Rachel, me, with the specific precision of a woman who had spent 32 years teaching students to mean exactly what they said. And she was not cruel about Daniel or Rachel. She was not vague either. She said about Daniel, Daniel loves the idea of this family more than the reality of it. He is not a bad person. He is a person who finds it considerably easier to have opinions than to be present. I have loved him exactly as he is. I have also understood exactly what he is. She said about Rachel, Rachel is afraid of things she cannot fix. I think she will carry guilt about this time, and I hope very much that she finds a way to put it down, because guilt carried too long becomes a different thing entirely. And about me, she said this. I listened to it 6 times before I could get through the whole thing without stopping. She said, Marcus, you gave up your life for me and I watched you do it, and I never found the right way to say what that meant while I still had the right words. I want to say it now while I still have them. I want you to know that I knew every single morning, every night call, every appointment where you held my hand in the waiting room and told the doctor what I couldn't always remember to say for myself. I knew it all. It mattered more than anything in my life has ever mattered. I want you to be all right. I want you to be better than all right, better than you were before this, not in spite of what you gave, but because of what giving it showed you about who you are. And I need you to hear this part most of all. You were never invisible to me. Not once, not for a single morning, not for a single night. You were exactly who I needed, and I knew it every day. That is the inheritance. That is the real one. The one no will revision could transfer. The one no court could contest. The one no August afternoon in a solicitor's office could reach. I sat in that storage unit for 3 hours. Then I called James Whitfield and told him about the phone. James submitted the recordings to the case as part of a broader pattern of evidence establishing my mother's actual intentions during the period of her full capacity. He paired them with the medical records showing her documented cognitive state during the August signing period. He had Beverly's letter signed, witnessed, specific. He had the original will with the handwritten addendum. He had 5 years of documented caregiving contributions. Daniel hired a solicitor from a firm in Vancouver, a good one from what I understand, well-resourced. He had the house and the portfolio at that point, which meant he had the resources to defend both. I had $43,000 in a storage unit and a phone in a shoebox. Rachel sent me a message in February, 4 months after I filed. It said, I've been thinking about everything very hard. I don't think I can be part of a contested process. If it's found that the August will was improper, I'm going to return my share voluntarily. I'm not able to hold something that I'm not certain is mine. I have read that message many times. I do not know entirely what to do with Rachel. She is not simple. This is not simple. I am not yet ready to resolve it into something clean. I want to be honest about this part because it gets left out of the version of this story that feels satisfying to tell. Legal action costs money I did not fully have. It costs time and a sustained form of emotional labor that is different from the acute pain of the original betrayal, lower grade, longer lasting, the kind of thing that becomes part of the texture of your mornings and requires active management before you've had your first cup of tea. There were months when the fight did not feel worth continuing. Not because the case was weak, James remained confident and careful throughout, but because fighting is tiring in a sustained way, and I was trying to rebuild everything else simultaneously, which meant I was not doing either thing with my full capacity. I had restarted contract work in January carefully, slowly, from absolute zero again. 1 client in January, 2 in March, 4 by June. The work felt harder than it had before, partly because I was older and the industry had moved, and partly because I was doing it alongside a legal process, and partly because I was doing it while also learning for the first time in years what it felt like to have mornings that belonged to me. I had a therapist named David. He asked me once directly, in the way he did things, what I was actually fighting for. The money or the record? I thought about it carefully before I answered. I said, the record. I need someone official to say out loud that what happened was what it was, that the document they produced in August was not her actual intention. David said, hold on to that. It's going to be what keeps you going when the financial outcome stops feeling like enough reason by itself. He was right. It was. The case settled 11 months after I filed. I'm not giving you the exact terms, they're confidential and that boundary matters to me, but I will tell you what I got. I got the house, not the portfolio, not the savings account. The house at 14 Orchard Lane. Daniel received a financial settlement from the estate proceeds. Rachel had already returned her share voluntarily and it was incorporated into the redistribution. The legal record formally set aside the August will. It does not say everything I wanted it to say. Legal language never has the precision of the feelings that drove you to the table, but it says enough. It says the August document was invalid. It says what Daniel organized in that room with my mother in her final weeks did not reflect her established and documented intentions. That is on the record. I need you to know that is on the record, not because it changes what happened, but because it happened and its happening needs to be named correctly somewhere official. I did not move back to 14 Orchard Lane immediately. I needed time with it as an idea before I could manage it as a place. I went there for the first time in February after the settlement completed. It was a cold morning, the kind where your breath shows. I stood in the kitchen and the light came through the window exactly the way it always had, sideways, the same quality it had every October morning I had woken up there. The table was still there, her chair was still there. I stood for a while without doing anything, and then I made tea and I spilled some of it cleaning up and I sat at the table. I am not living there yet. I go sometimes to sit in the garden to let the house be familiar again without being painful. I have started thinking carefully about what I want it to become. Not a monument to what happened, not a museum of what was lost. Something that carries the truth of what happened there, all of it, the good years and the hard years and the mornings and the nights, without being imprisoned by any single version of it. I don't have a fully formed answer yet. I'm working on it. I'm okay with not having it yet. It has been 19 months since the will reading. The consultancy has 8 clients. It is not where I imagine being at 35, not the version of it I was building at 29, but it is real and it is mine, and I built it from zero twice, which means I understand every single piece of it in a way I didn't the first time. There is a specific kind of ownership that only comes from rebuilding. I didn't want to learn that. But I know it now and I'm not pretending it doesn't have value. I met someone, her name is Clara, we have been together 8 months. It is early and careful and good in the way that things are good when you have learned what sustained giving without reciprocity costs you, and you are being deliberate this time about what you offer and to whom. I told her the full story on our 3rd date. She listened until I had finished, and then she said, that's a great deal to have carried entirely alone. I said, yes. She said, you don't have to do that anymore. I didn't cry in the restaurant. I did on the walk home, briefly, in the cold. Not from sadness, from something more like relief. The particular relief of having the thing you needed to hear said by someone who wasn't obligated to say it. I listen to the voice notes sometimes, not every day anymore. On specific days, her birthday, the September anniversary, mornings when I need to hear a specific voice say a specific thing. You were never invisible to me, not once. Not for a single morning. I play that one when I need it, and then I get up and I go to work. Daniel sent a message 4 months after the settlement completed. It said, I hope we can find a way to move forward at some point. Family matters to me. I read it. I haven't responded. I don't know if I will. I don't think I am required to make that decision on a timeline that suits him. Rachel and I talked in September, 40 minutes. Careful, incomplete, both of us aware that we were holding things we hadn't yet found the language for. It was not a resolution. It was the beginning of something uncertain, and I am holding it as that nothing more, nothing less. Here is what I know. I showed up every morning for 5 years. I held her hand in waiting rooms and I introduced myself to her on bad Tuesdays, and I ran the tap so she couldn't hear me cry, and I was there every single time she needed someone to be there. I did it because she was my mother and she deserved someone who stayed. I would do it again. I have to believe that. I do believe that, and she knew. She set it into a phone in a shoebox before the words became harder to find, and she left it in a place where I would eventually look. She gave me the thing that no revision could redistribute and no legal argument could contest. She gave me certainty. The specific, irreducible certainty that the person you gave everything for knew exactly what you gave. I think that's enough. I think it has to be enough. When I sit in that kitchen and the light comes through sideways on the days I can sit there, I think it actually is. You can spend years giving everything to someone and never hear them say they saw it, and you can spend one afternoon in a storage unit in November and hear them say it perfectly. Some people leave their love where you have to look for it. That doesn't make it less real. It makes it more so because they knew what they were leaving and they left it anyway.